She signed the contract with trembling fingers and tears that would not be wiped away. The pen felt absurdly heavy, as if it carried every demand she had ever been forced to swallow. Across the mahogany table, portraits in gilt frames watched without pity. The urn with her mother's ashes sat beside the paper, a small lacquer box the size of a heart, sealed with a ribbon Ani had braided years ago. Madame G's lawyer had set the terms, and the silence between them had been louder than any accusation. Sign, or the keepsakes are gone forever. Ani looked down at her wrist. The thin band of cloth, her hair tie, frayed from a dozen afternoons in the studio, lay there like a promise. She had braided it herself when she was 19, and had thought she could stitch the future to her hands. Now it was only a loop of cotton against her skin, a reminder of a different, colder night. "I can't," she said once, and the word cracked like porcelain. "You can," said a voice that sounded like certainty and consequence turned into flesh. Gianni stood across from her with a newspaper folded in his hands and a look that was careful as a curtain's fall. His face had the same lines she remembered in the man who had saved her years ago, the soft hollows at the cheekbones, the slow curve of an apologetic smile. But his eyes were older, and his hands had a different patience. It took her a moment to believe them the same. She signed. Outside, the city crawled on in indifferent light. Inside the study, the photograph on the mantel showed a younger Gianni, leisurely, a model of an heir and better seasons. She slid the contract back across the wood. The lawyer tucked it away with a polite nod. Madame G did not rise. She observed Ani from the carved sofa like judgment made flesh. The matriarch who had never learned the word mercy. Ani's mouth tasted like rust. She had thought, in a brief and hopeful corner of herself, that contracting marriage could be a simple transaction. An exchange of names, a trade for a box of her mother's things. Survival had a currency many could not see. She had learned to count it anyway. When she was outside, the alley felt too narrow. Her hands burned from the cold. A driver waited. The G Estate's carriages claimed the streets like territories. Someone, one of the younger men in the family, pressed a finger lightly on the box with her mother's ashes and smiled as if this were a joke. On the train back to her studio, Ani tried to remember the mathematics of the deal she had just made. How many small deaths would this marriage require? How many of her own days could she spend inside a house not built for her? She thought of a winter night with snow that had turned the world mute. I remember the snow as if it were a sound. It came down like paper flakes, and it wanted to hide everything. We were small in that world. My hands were numb. He put a hair tie on my wrist and said, "Keep this."
He had a scar near his left ear and a laugh that made the street safe again. He left without a name. The memory pressed against the present, warm and impossible. Gilbert had been a shadow that turned into a man that night, young, urgent, and impossible to forget. He had pulled Ani from that alley of knives and whispered wild promises that were not his to make. He had left her a hair tie, one she still tucked beneath sleeves during long nights at the bench, and a notebook with a page bent in the middle where he had once written, "I will protect you until my breath gives out." The notebook had been her mother's. The crease was still there, like a hinge. Back in the present, the G Estate rose in black stone and clipped hedges. Photographers called out to one another across the manicured lawn when she arrived, expecting the sort of drama that filled tabloids. The gate closed behind her with a soft final clunk. Inside, attendants bowed, then did not look at her face in a way that could be called kind. The house was all corridors built to display things, art, trophies, alliances. It smelled faintly of bergamot and old paper. Gianni met her in a room that could have been a small theater. He stood away from the light, so his silhouette read older, more severe. When he came closer, he smelled like smoke and citrus, and something that made Ani's breath hitch, not because it was the smell itself, but because memory bent the smell into a shape she had thought buried, the smell of the stranger who had once rescued her. "You signed," he said simply, as if he were admiring a row of boxed watches. His tone was not cruel, it was untroubled, the way a judge's voice is untroubled. Ani wanted to tell him about the hair tie and the snowy night and the way a young man's hands had steadied her. She wanted to ask if he knew the man who had saved her. She wanted everything at once. Instead, she tucked that want into a corner and offered the smallest political smile. "My mother is home," she said. The words were both true and not. He set a glass down on the table between them. "Is she?" His look was thoughtful to the point of being dangerous. He touched the cloth of her hair tie with 2 fingers, as if checking the weave. For a heartbeat, the touch was the same as the one she had been given years ago, gentle, retrieving. Then his hand withdrew, and the same hand folded into the firm, indifferent grip of the air. In the days that followed, the house did what opulent houses always do. It rearranged her. Rooms filled with guardians. There were cameras in the hallways that watched shadows like predators watch prey. Ani was allowed to work in a small, sunless room that the estate insisted was a studio, though its windows hid more than they allowed light to reach. She made pieces there under a jar light and the constant scrutiny of an assistant who took notes in a careful, practiced hand.
Johnny hovered in the way that possession hovers, close enough to claim, distant enough to deny. At dusk, he would appear at the studio door carrying something, a repaired clasp, a rare stone, a criticism wrapped in a smile, and for a breathless second, Ani felt the old thrill of rescue. He burned incense and softened the evening like someone trying to make amends in small increments. He could be intuitive in a way that misled. He learned the rhythm of her hands, the cadence of her breath when she worked, the way she frowned when metal would not cooperate. But the kindness came always alongside something else. He would remind her of her obligations and of the things she had no power to save. Once, when she asked after her mother's diary, which contained sketches and a few lines in a cramped, loving hand, he paused before answering. "It is safer here," he said slowly. "Safer than in a studio that is hardly supervised." "Safer for whom?" Ani almost said. She had only the breath between fury and fear. Instead, she said, "For me." He did not look surprised. He kissed the top of her head that evening in the library and called it a courtesy. It would never be called tenderness in an ordinary dictionary. It was the sort of touch that announced ownership. At night, Ani would put her hand beneath her pillow and fold herself around the discreet loop of cloth, as if the gesture could make her a pocket in which memory might be kept. The diary was hidden in the folds of her mother's shawl, which she had tucked into the seam of an old trunk. A page often stuck out with a word on it, "For you, always." She began to leave messages to herself in the margins of sketches. If there was a plan, she would note it. Escape, file, call. Each little command was a small animal that might be crushed by the house's wheels of custom and wealth. The studio's days were punctuated by the occasional ceremony. The G family celebrated art the way other families celebrated their dynasties. It was a ritual that ensured the world would watch and then forget. Ani's work was given to the display case for a week. A judge from the city's design council visited. Among the visitors was a man whose name she would later hear muttered in houses and cafes, Stephen, an art critic with a reputation for merciless honesty and a compassion hidden behind a harder edge. He stood before her display and regarded the pieces like a surgeon appraising a damaged organ. He did not smile. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Ani's with an unreadable expression, and Ani felt for a single second like an uninvited thing on someone's otherwise neat hands. "You work with memory," he said. "Most designers forget their roots and forge paths to none. You do not." The remark was little more than a pinprick, but it felt like recognition. She should have basked in it. Instead, she swallowed a warning from beneath her ribs. His attention was a light that found weak seams. That night, she received a call.
The voice on the other end, someone who might have been a friend once, warned her not to present at the upcoming competition. "They don't want you out there," the voice said. "They'll make you disappear." The idea that someone would take something so small from her, her name, her chance to be seen, made her laugh, a dry sound. But even as she laughed, she felt the house lean in to listen.
The first attempt came at dinner a week later. The dining room was a long aquarium of polished wood and low candles. Portraits watched from the walls like the family's memories. Ani's entree arrived with a small bowl of milk beside it. An old woman's remedy, Johnny said, for nervousness. He offered the spoon with a patron's smile. She reached for it, then halted. Something in the way the spoon quivered told her this was no ordinary tenderness. The assistant at her shoulder, the one with the careful notations, had eyes that did not blink. Ani put the spoon down and said she might go for a walk instead. "You should not walk alone at night," Johnny said mildly. "They have been busy." At the door, someone had left a pigeon with a note tied to its leg. The note said, "Do not play heroin. You will not be saved twice." The bird had been released in the garden and found its way to the kitchen. No one would admit to sending it. The house's small cruelties were not always dramatic. They arrived like rain. The diary would be missing and then returned, pages smudged. Her mother's shawl would be found in the laundry, damp and smelling of other rooms. A hair tie would vanish from her wrist and then appear on the banister like a mysterious breadcrumb. She began to map the house with the trust of someone mapping an enemy camp. The corridors that led to the library were monitored. The guest wing had an exit that claimed to go to the service road, but actually led into a patch of hedges where security could catch an attempt at escape in minutes. The cameras were not enough of a net to catch everything. The human eyes were the worst. One morning, Ani found a new man on the estate grounds inspecting a fountain. He was in his late 30s, sharp-featured, polite toward property but not people. His hands folded a cigarette like a proof of patience. He introduced himself as Mr. Thomas, a consultant from the city council. He stayed precisely long enough that everyone in the household would remember seeing him, then left. Johnny held a small private conversation with Mr. Thomas afterward in the conservatory and called Ani in to hear him say her name with a breezy, distant interest that made her skin crawl. "We have to be careful about what you display in public," he said. The attempts escalated. A van idled outside the studio one afternoon when Ani met a client. When she stepped out, an arm reached in through the passenger window and tried to snag her back. She escaped by slamming the car door into the arm and turning the heel of her hand into someone's wrist.
The driver had been small and quick. The assistant took the bag and walked with a brisk, relentless care. When she reported the attempt to the household, the master of ceremonies, an austere man called Mr. Park, shrugged like one who shrugs at weather reports. "Someone is testing us." But the house did not simply protect her. It was a machine that sometimes ran on its own prejudices. There were slaps of insult that arrived folded into teacups. A portrait that once hung in her mother's room, now displayed in the family's private sitting room, and Ani learned by a painful bargaining that it had been removed from her mother's little cabinet, not absent-mindedly, but as a demonstration. Ownership could be taught with gestures. In the midst of this, Gianni remained a complicated weather system. He could be steady and then storm. One night, after she had tried and failed to attend a late audition for a design showcase, he found her on the terrace weeping into her hands. He sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had that same low, almost weary warmth. "You were brave tonight," he said softly. "I will not let them touch your work." In that moment, Ani imagined that he could be a fortress. She wanted to lean into him and be held. Instead, she pressed her forehead into her knees and thought of the face of the man who had once put a hair tie in her hand in a blizzard and then left like a ghost who had been kind by mistake. There were moments of tenderness, too small to save her, large enough to fool her. He would stand by the studio door with a repaired tool, hand it to her and say, "I watched you work, you're good." Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he would tuck the scar tissue near his ear with 2 fingers and smile at some private thought. At other times, his public persona reasserted itself. He would disappear into rooms where decisions were made about wills and inheritances. He would call family councils where conversations were quickly transformed into diktats. Madame G would preside like a starved queen, her fingers tracing the surfaces of tables as if reading them for betrayal. The family had rules that no one explained to Ani, but everyone enforced. She learned the forms of obedience like a foreign language. A week before the competition she wanted so badly to attend, a box arrived on her studio desk. It was wooden and sealed with wax. Inside, wrapped in old silk, lay a hair tie she had never seen before. It was a coarse thing, knotted in a crude way, and it smelled faintly of smoke. A small note accompanied it. "Keep this, it will be useful." Her breath stopped. She turned the ribbon over in her hand. The knot was the same method, the same hurried loop, as the knot the man had used on the snowy night. The more she looked, the less she dared to name what she felt. Was it hope? A trap? A promise renewed?
She took the box to Gianni. He opened it as if unwrapping a custom-made thing.
He ran his thumb along the knot and frowned. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "I don't know," Ani said honestly. He folded the note and taped it into his palm like a judge closing a case. "Keep it," he said finally. "It's better to have it in a safe place." Being told to keep something never made it safe. It often meant the opposite. The competition day arrived in a mix of rain and low light. Ani had cobbled her courage together from tired pieces. She wrapped a piece of her mother's shawl around the pendant she had made and took a taxi that felt too small for the space of her chest. On the way, her phone buzzed with a message of 3 letters from an unknown number. "Do not go." She nearly turned the cab around. Instead, she walked into the auditorium, past rows of people who looked at young designers as if vetting whether they were worth an existence. Giselle sat in the front row, impeccably dressed, expression like a rock pool. When Ani's piece was lifted into the light, she felt as if she had offered her palm to the world and the world had touched it. Applause was lukewarm. A judge noted a flaw she had known all along. The clasp was unusual, not practical enough for everyday wear. She felt the room tilt. After the show, someone brushed her arm in the corridor, an older woman with hands that rummaged too quickly through purses and then vanished. A man in a dark suit slid a pamphlet into her hand that had the chief family crest on it as if to remind her of where she had come from. Back at the estate, there was a message waiting at the studio door. It was from the lawyer, succinct, professional. "You are required to attend a family funeral tomorrow. Your presence is requested as a courtesy." There was no courtesy in the note. Funerals at the G house were rituals of selection. It was not always the dead who were mourned. Sometimes it was the living who were sorted by their usefulness. Ani dressed in somber colors and took her mother's diary from the trunk. She slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat and told herself she would keep it safe. On the day of the so-called funeral, the family gathered in a small chapel the estate kept to one side. She didn't know whose service it was. Names were switched like props. The priest called out scripture in a voice that folded the air. Ani felt the weight of all the eyes in the pews and her mouth tasted like winter. During the service, someone opened the chapel door with too much force, and a shadow slipped in, a man dragged in like evidence. He lay on a pallet up front, and a nurse or family attendant fussed in a clinical way that made Ani's stomach twist. A face protruded from beneath a sheet, as paused like a question. The sheet was drawn back. It was him. G's face stared up, pale and still, and for a second Ani could not find a sound. The camera of memory that had always kept his laughter on loop seized and stopped. The hair tie sensation, like a tender, useless token, fell from her hands. She walked forward as if drawn by a string, and the room made space around her. They said it was proof. The nurse said the word in a way that tried to be compassionate and instead sounded like a verdict. Identification confirmed. Madame G's eyes did not leave the body. She leaned forward like a woman reading a line that had been waiting for her approval. Johnny's face stared up, pale, and folded his hands and lowered his head. Someone near the priest began to whisper, "This settles matters." A small murmur of finality made the chapel sound like a sealed box. Ani wanted to scream that this was a lie. She wanted to claw at the sheet and see if the face beneath was only a mask. But grief had a way of making the throat close like a gate. She felt the diary in her inside pocket thrum against her ribs as if someone were knocking from the inside. Later in the corridor, John frowned her. He did not look at the body, but rather at her. There were 1,000 articles he could have said. Condolences, platitudes. But instead he held out a small bottle wrapped in a square of linen. The fabric suggested care. The bottle was unmarked. "There are limits to what words can do," he said quietly. "But there are remedies that can change measurements of time in this house. I have something that might undo what has been done, or at least make a certain kind of repair possible." Annie's hands closed around the linen as if it could be a lifeline. She felt suddenly very small, as if a current had swept her into a deeper river and she could not find the bank. "What is it?" she asked, and her voice sounded thin to her own ears.
"It is not miraculous," John said. He folded his fingers around the bottle, and the sound was dry as paper. "It is not a cure in any sermon book sense, but it can help in ways that we can use. There will be a price." A sharp, surprised anger rose in Annie that tasted like copper. "A price?" she repeated. She thought of the contract she had signed, the way the world had counted her in units. John's face did not pull to something cruel. "Everything has a price," he said. "Especially here." "Who pays?" she demanded. The diary felt like a living thing in her pocket, and she did not know whether she could bear to take it out and read the lines that might be the only map back to who she once was. "You might," he said simply. "Or you might choose. There is a task. A portrait. A presentation that will require you to stand naked in front of an audience and tell a story not all of which is yours to tell. If you succeed, there is a means to put a body back into motion that can be helpful. If you fail, there are consequences." Annie thought of the hair tie. She thought of the snowy night when a young man had taken her hand and pulled her out of a world that wanted to wound her. She thought of a dozen small mercies that had folded into this one bleak argument. The house was a machine for extracting things. And now it had found a new lover.
"Tell me what to do," she said. John looked like a man listening to an offer he had expected. "Tomorrow," he said, "paint the portrait as you would imagine him. Call it by the name you choose. Bring your diary. Tell the truth you are willing to tell. The rest will be a negotiation." Annie agreed. Her mind was a sieve of sensation. The bottle felt like a coin she had not meant to accept. She went back to her studio and told no one. The assistant looked at her with an expression she could not read. The diary pressed against her ribs like a heart. There were cracks in the house that did not mend with time. Annie sat on the edge of her bed and opened the diary. Her mother's handwriting was smaller than she remembered, and it smelled faintly of lavender and old ink. The words were a ladder she had used to climb out of earlier darkness. The page she opened to had an entry with a date Annie could not place. At the top, in a slant she knew as a mother's, were a few lines that made her hands shake. "For you, always, keep the knot of the hair tie. If someone comes to claim you with paper and a name, remember, names are not always anchors. Trust the small things that outlast professions." Beneath that, in a different hand, sudden and jagged as a foreign signature, was a line that made the blood in her ears line up like a stringed instrument. "I rescued her that night. I left because I had nowhere to stay. If she remembers me by the hair tie, it will be enough." The line was unsigned. Annie read it twice, then 3 times. The studio's lamp hummed with a lazy steadiness. Outside the house, somewhere, a car door closed. The diary was a map and a mirror. It told her that the young man who had saved her had been real, and perhaps gone. It did not say who had taken his place. She folded the page and tucked the diary back into her coat. Her hands were steady now with a strange kind of resolve, the way someone steadies when they have decided to throw themselves into a current rather than be swept away by it. In the morning, Gianni walked her to the gallery where she would paint the portrait. He stood a little to the side as if to hide his hands. The man in the studio had the same jaw as Gilendong in photographs her mother had kept, the line, the curve. He had the same small habit of rubbing a thumb against a scar. But the hair at his temples were threaded with a different silver, the skin around his eyes mapped by more winters than the man in the memory could have known. When Annie looked at his face in the light, it was like finding a photograph buried under other photographs. Lines that had not been visible before were now pronounced. He looked older, much older. Gianni's idiosyncrasies were similar to those of the man who had once left a hair tie in a storm, and the resemblance had been a rope that Annie had clung to without knowing how fray it was. She stopped painting, and the brush left a wet, errant mark across the canvas. The studio smelled, suddenly, like the moment before a confession. "You look like him," she said aloud, a statement that was also a question. She wanted to ask more, how the brand could imitate the exact softness of someone else's laugh, but the painting required her breath, and the bottle in John's pocket waited. Gianni's response was quiet, measured. "I take after my family," he said. "We are a hereditary brand," weighted like an unseen coin. The canvas held a face that was a careful composite: memory, rumor, and design. When she lifted the brush again, the paint stuck to the linen and made a skin that was too young and too old at the same time. The image became a place where she could set the question down and work on it like a jeweler sets a stone, with small, precise motions until the light found the right plane. Someone rapped at the studio door. The assistant answered and came back with a face Annie recognized from the house: Mr. Park, the maitre of the household routines. He stood with an envelope in his hand and a look that pretended to be weakly surprised to find her not in the family salon. "You have a visitor," he said, "from the John residence." Annie's throat made a small sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so thoroughly frightened. John entered as he always did, as if he had been given permission to step where others feared to tread. He stood for a moment at the doorway and regarded the canvas. "You're making him young," he said. "I'm making him as I remember him," she answered. The brush trembled. "I don't know the rest." "Memory is a good jeweler," John said. He sat and folded his hands, the linen bottled remedy placed carefully on the table between them. "It strips things down to what matters." Annie thought of the sealed box with her mother's ashes and how thin the difference between something kept and something taken could be. She pushed the diary toward him without meaning to and watched his fingers close over the worn cover like a claim. "You will have to be convincing before them," he said. "It is not only about likeness, it is about motive. Why would you say words you cannot prove? Why would you present a man who can no longer answer?" "He saved me," she said. The sentence was small enough to fit into a coin purse, but it held more weight than the house's scales could bear. She pushed the diary toward him without meaning to, and watched his fingers close over the worn cover like a claim. "You will have to be convincing before them," he said. "It is not only about likeness, it is about motive. Why would you say words you cannot prove? Why would you present a man who can no longer answer?" "He saved me," she said. The sentence was small enough to fit into a coin purse, but it held more weight than the house's scales could bear. She pushed the diary toward him without meaning to, and watched his fingers close over the worn cover like a claim. "You will have to be convincing before them," he said. "It is not only about likeness, it is about motive. Why would you say words you cannot prove? Why would you present a man who can no longer answer?" "He saved me," she said. The sentence was small enough to fit into a coin purse, but it held more weight than the house's scales and bear. She pushed the diary toward him without meaning to, and watched his fingers close over the worn cover like a claim. John's eyes were difficult. He tapped the bottle in its linen. "There are ways to shift certain states. It is medicine, not magic. It requires belief, and at times, sacrifice." He let the word hang in the air like a sentence that needed to be decided upon. Annie's breath felt thin. The portrait in front of her stared without eyes, only the suggestion of them. And in that blankness she could place any truth she dared to. The house remained patient, as if waiting to see which truth she would choose to build. She had signed. "Today," he said, "you will tell a story and let them decide whether your story is proof. The room will not be kind. That is expected. The trick is to make them understand why you remember someone." She unfolded the diary with hands that did not shake as much as she thought they would. The paper had the soft smell of ink and lavender. She slid a single page free and read aloud what her mother had written years before, the voice small and private, but steady in the gallery's hush. "For you, always. Keep the knot of the hair tie. If someone comes to claim you with paper and a name, remember, names are not always anchors. Trust the small things that outlast professions." The line landed in the air between the chairs like a coin forced into silence. A murmur ran across the assembled faces: judges, relatives, a couple of family functionaries pretending to be bored. Gianni remained at the back, shaded by the doorway, the lamplight catching the gray at his temples. Up close, the differences in him were clearer. The hands that had signed the contract earlier were shot through with veins like mapped rivers. His laugh wrinkles were deep. His gait was deliberately unhurried. He looked older than a man who might have once been someone else's memory. Annie stepped forward with a slate of sketches and the portrait she had begun. The canvas still bore fresh strokes of paint where uncertainty had been forced into form, the cheek not yet complete, the eyes a suggestion rather than a gaze. She spoke, and her speech was not an argument but an incision into the room's complacency. "This is him as I remember," she said. "Not as proof, not as a certainty. Memory changes things until they are the size of truths you can carry."
She set the diary and the hair tie on the table. "I ask you to see the rest for me." The judges took notes, their faces professional cliffs. Madam G sat in the second row like a crown made of thin ice. No one smiled. When Annie finished, the rustle of pens and the shuffle of opinions sounded like a verdict being arranged. John approached and touched the linen-wrapped bottle with a finger. "You spoke the truth you were willing to stand by," he said. "That alone can move a room. It is enough for me to move." He folded the linen back over the bottle and offered it to her like an ambiguous benediction. "But the rest is a negotiation with risks and proof. You understand that?" She did. She understood the kind of bargains the world had once offered her. Small trades, loud prices. To get the bottle safely, she needed more than performance. She needed leverage. A soft commotion at the door cut across them. Mr. Park appeared with a man Annie did not recognize. Striped suit, eyes like someone used to think he did not want to be noticed. He bowed to Madam G and then to the room and announced, bureaucratic and bland, that a secure transfer had been arranged. The bottle would be moved under family custody pending legal clearance. The words landed like a lock.
"We do not trust outside hands here," Mr. Park said. "It is policy." John's expression flickered, a darkening he tried to hide. He looked at Annie as if asking whether she could bear this. Her stomach clenched. The bottle, her potential miracle, her proof, her ransom, would be sealed away by the very people she wanted to sway. "You don't have to hand it over," John said quietly. "There's a way to demonstrate its intent. Let me watch you. Let me assure you we are not giving it to people who will ruin it." Madam G stood then, with the slow motion of someone who knows how to make a room understand whose breath counts. "This is not a negotiation for the family's secrets," she said. "We will abide by proper channels. Miss Annie has already benefited from our hospitality. We will not be lectured by outsiders about what is right." The words were a closing of doors. Annie felt them settle like dust. She thought of the little lacquer box in the lawyer's hands, the urn like a currency she had pawned. She had signed. She had already put her name to something. Now the house wanted to replace the bottle with paper and more locks. John stepped away, polite and cool, but his eyes lingered on her. "There will be other chances," he said. It sounded like a threat and a promise if she could read him correctly. The family led the bottle away to a locked cabinet. For the first time since she had stepped into the G world, Annie wondered whether she had simply traded one prison for another. The hair tie in her pocket rubbed against her hip like a small animal trying to get out. That night she slept in a room with heavy curtains and a lamp that threw pools of light rather than the even wash of day. Gianni appeared at the door, not with absurdly staged tenderness, but with a quiet that admitted everything. "You did well today," he said. "You told the story you could tell." She did not answer, because answering felt dangerous in a house where words were always wagers. He sat on the edge of the chair and looked at the hair tie she kept at the bedside. For the first time since they had met, he said something that made the thin film of control at the surface of his person crack. "Your mother trusted you," he said. "She left instructions that were more practical than she meant them to be." "You knew about her notes?" Annie asked. Suspicion immediately knifed through her. Had Gianni been reading her mother's pages like a household ledger? "I know a great many things about the family," he said. His voice softened in a way that was not entirely political. "And I kept them out of sight of my mother's worst impulses where I could." She wanted to ask how he, heir and instrument of the house, could have protected anything from his own kin. Instead, she asked the question that had snagged at her heart since the chapel. "Did you know a man named Gilbert?" The name came out as if an offering that might conjure. For the first time, his eyes changed.
Something like an old photograph passed across his face. "I knew a man called Gilbert," he said carefully. "He worked here for a short while. He had the habit of laughing like someone who had been given a second wind. He was brave in ways that frightened most of us." "And the scar near his ear?" Ani's voice was smaller. Gianni's fingers went to his temple without thinking. He pressed at the place where scar tissue had softened the skin. "If he had a scar there, it is not surprising," he said. "We have all gotten marks in our time. He was not a man built for long sheltering." "You're avoiding me," Ani said. Her heart pounded at the confession she wanted. Did you ever save me that night?" He looked at his hands as if looking for an answer inside them. The silence that followed was a wall between two rooms. "No," he said at last.
I did not. Ani felt the ground rearrange under her feet in a sudden way. She had tied herself with desperate fingers and a pen to something predicated on resemblance. She had seen a contour of kindness and mistaken it for history. He stood then and left without the small kindnesses he sometimes offered. There was the air of someone having given away an important piece of himself and found it lighter for the gesture. Ani lay awake, the diary's words like a ladder out of darkness, but the ladder's rungs had no guarantee. She had given her name to a house that arranged even its gestures of mercy as a kind of tax. The attempts at undermining her continued in the subtle, patient way a storm corrodes a cliff. The diary pages were mislaid, a tray of letters delivered days late, a petty theft staged to unsettle her. The hair tie reappeared on the banister with new fraying. Someone whispered threats through the walls on nights when the house's machinery hummed too loud. She came to accept that the house's small cruelties were part of the contract she had signed, and she catalogued them the way a person tracks bruises. 2 weeks after the portrait day, the threat grew hands-on. Ani thought she was being escorted to a meeting with a solicitor. Instead, Mr. Park led her through back corridors to a room with a curling door that smelled faintly of metal. The light was low. The single chair in the center had straps on either arm. A man in a dark jacket stood by the far wall with a printer and a small, expressionless smile. "We need a signature," Mr. Park said, unfolding a document with the calm of someone reading a weather report. "It's a clarification to the contract, just a housekeeping measure." She had learned the hard arithmetic of paperwork. Add one signature, subtract one right. She asked to see a lawyer. The man smiled like someone who likes the script he's been given. "You'll have to sign for protection," he said. "It's only the usual." Her threat tightened. She might have refused if she had been alone. Someone knocked on the door. 2 quick, deliberate raps.
The man with the printer rapped again, and a voice from the corridor said, "We need this done now." The straps on the chair were explained away as a relic. Ani's notice focused on the small things, the seam of the chair, the hair tie she had left in her pocket suddenly burning like a fuse. Her hands were steady as the man placed a pen in front of her, but steadiness was often the muscle someone learns when they are being broken in small stages. In the flurry at the doorway, someone misstepped, and a lamp fell, scattering glass. The room flared for a beat, and in that brief motion, the man with the printer lunged forward and the straps were upon her. Cold fear cut the air. An attempt had been made to render her immobile, to sign on a paper she did not understand. She tasted the iron of panic. A shadow interposed itself at the door, and a voice like a hand opening in winter said, "That's enough." Gianni stood there, his coat as if he had walked in from a winter storm. For all his composed public persona, his movements in that moment had the urgency of someone who had prepared for emergency. He stepped into the room and took, with a single motion that was both force and tenderness, the man's arm. The man did not resist. "You will leave," Gianni said to Mr. Park, the words low and regulated in a way that made the printer man look foolish with his own calm. "Both of you." The men left, faces tight with the knowledge they had been seen. Gianni turned to Ani. His hands were dry and smelled faintly of citrus and smoke. "I am sorry," he said. It was the simplest of things. It was not an apology for all he represented, but for that moment it might have been large enough. She wanted to say that his presence had saved her in that room in the same way some remembered saviors had, brute, immediate, unavoidable. But the day the pen had been forced into her hand had already happened. Signatures cannot be unsigned by good intentions. "We'll make a report," he said. "I will make sure you are safe." She looked at the hair tie in her hand. It would not save her. Not on its own. There were other attempts after that. An attempt to drug her at a family brunch, a staged blackout while she slept so that someone could rifle her trunk. Each time, the house proved itself both predator and protector. Gianni was sometimes the hand that slid between the threat and her skin. Sometimes he was the voice that read papers aloud, and sometimes he was the man who counted her out as property in a room full of ledger books. The day the staged corpse re-entered the plot, the house thought it had closed a case. The family produced, with the solemnity of legal theater, a photograph on glossy paper. Gilbert, posed like someone who had fallen asleep on a bench. The caption said that identity had been established and the problem of the past solved. Madame G allowed the photograph to be used like a stamp, a closing of a wound. But secrets, like broken things in Ani's own life, do not go quietly. One of the house staff, an elderly woman who fed the conservatory birds and kept more than petals in the folds of her apron, found a small rolled paper while cleaning a guest room. It was a short note, folded thrice. She slipped it into her pocket like a thief hiding bread. That night, the woman approached Ani in the service corridors where no cameras lingered. Her voice was low and rough. "There was a man here," she said. "He does not belong. He has been moved. They tried to make him less than what he is." Ani's heart did the strange jump of someone who dared to hope. The woman handed over the scrap of paper. It had a name and a place scrawled in a hurried hand. St. Luke's, Ward B, Bed 6. Something in Ani's chest rearranged. The diary had been honest in its forgetting. Names are not always angers, but addresses can be. John reappeared that night like a promise one makes when they have nothing left to lose. He had been quieter than usual, less theatrical. He offered Ani a plan that smelled of danger and possibility in equal measures. "There is a man," he said. "He was not killed. They presented a body to make everyone look away. I have people who have seen the wrong corpse. They can find the right one, but only if you are willing to step into a trade." Ani's hands clenched the hair tie until the knot felt like a small bead of pain. "What sort of trade?" she asked. "The remedy will take a man from a very precarious state. It will cost—" He hesitated, then met her eye. "It will cost a guarantor. Someone has to sign that they will assume certain risks, and it must be someone in the man's life. A spouse has clout." The room's air felt like winter glass. Ani pictured a bed in St. Luke's, a man breathing with machines, or not breathing at all. She pictured the hair tie fastened around a bruised wrist, a scar, laughter like a memory someone plays on loop. The bargain was simple and terrible. Her status at the G house could be the key to pulling a man back from the silence they had dressed as death. "So you need me to sign," she said. "To give consent," Gongming said. "To allow the medicine to be used, to make the exchange live." It sounded small until she thought of what it meant. It meant legal complicity in a risky procedure at a house that habitually dragged things across the threshold like exhibits. It meant she would have to trade. Again. "I'll do it," she said. It was the only answer she knew how to give that did not involve fleeing. The hair tie in her pocket felt hot, as if it too had agreed. The next morning, the house arranged transport without ceremony. A small white ambulance took her to St. Luke's under the pretense of hospital visitation. The ward smelled like sick paper and bleach. Machines hummed.
She was led past curtains and beds, into a room with a man on a pallet, who had been kept in the dim hours of the night as something the house would not let anyone see. He looked like Gilbert only when he was unlit by memory. Machines pulled a rhythm over his chest. Bandages hit a cheek. However the mercy worked that allowed the house to show a corpse and keep the living, the man before her had the same scar by the ear, the same line of a mouth clipped, as if a painter had sketched him. His skin had the dull look of someone whose life had been paused. John explained the procedure with a dryness that suggested he had already mourned the things that could not be fixed. "This is not a miracle," he said. "It is a carefully prepared series of medications and a practice we have used in controlled settings. It is risky. It might wake him. It might not. The family must sign and allow the administration. Without legal consent from someone close to him, we cannot proceed." The paper they offered Ani was a bundle of clinical language and legal clauses. Her name was listed as the consenting spouse. She would be the one to say it was acceptable to attempt to reverse the state he was in. She thought of the hair tie the man had given her in that snow. She thought of how a small knot in cotton could carry the weight of a debt. She thought of her mother's diary and the line that said, "If someone comes to claim you with paper and a name, remember, names are not always anchors." She signed. The ink sucked itself into the paper, making a small sound like a bird folding itself into sleep. With the signature came a paper trail that allowed the medical team to proceed.
The remedy was administered under the watchful eye of a physician, who held her hand for a moment and then looked far away. Day stretched itself thin. The monitors beeped and failed into patterns. The nurses described changes in tones too small for anyone untrained to notice. Gong Ming waited like someone in prayer with his face turned toward a god of devices and unlikely alliances. Gianni took a chair against the wall and folded his hands. Neither of them slept. When the man stirred, it was first an eyelid, then a breath, then a sink of the shoulders that made Ani feel as if something inside her had righted itself. His fingers twitched. He grunted as if waking from a deep, old cold. "Gilbert?" she whispered. His eyes opened with the slowness of a photograph developing. They were not sharp. They were the color of someone who had been dressed in night for too long and now needed time to find their day. He tried to speak, the sound a small, rough instrument tuned to a faraway street. Something like a laugh escaped him, and his hand found the hair tie on Ani's wrist, as if it had been held long enough for him to guess where it lay. Ani had never seen someone come back and look so much like a stranger in the act of recognizing people they had loved. His smile was a memory waking.
John remained in the corner, with his back a little straight. "It worked," he said, but he said it like someone confessing a sin, not a triumph. There was celebration, quick and brittle. In the privacy of a hospital hallway, John pressed the small linen-wrapped bottle into Ani's hands. "This is not a cure for everything," he said. "It will keep him stable long enough for him to decide how much of the past he wants to face, but you should know what you offered." "I know," she said. They took the man back to a recovery room, where nurses arranged pillows like small ceasefires. He was awake enough to smile, awake enough to trace the hair tie, awake enough to ask about a woman and a winter. He did not remember everything. Memory had sutures like seams. It takes time for threads to match up. The family learned of the revival the way houses learn of rain, by the sound of ceilings creaking. Madame G came to the ward in a way that made everyone in the corridor breathe as if they had been asked to hold the world together. Her face was a weather map of approval and calculation. "He was a liability," she said plainly, the words more fact than malice. "But he served a purpose to us. We cannot afford liabilities." Gianni stepped forward and said, "He served more than one purpose, Mother." His voice had the same edge she had heard when he had chased away men in corridors. The air between him and Madame G had always contained the possibility of another kind of war. One fought in wills and ledgers instead of blood. Against the line of her mother's diary and the man asleep in the room, something else began to move, a record in a file left by a careless relative or a family accountant. It was a small paper with a photograph and an official stamp, left in a drawer open too wide by someone who had forgotten to close the money books. Ani found it in the course of the recovery, a sheet with Gianni's name and a date of birth. She had not expected to look. She did not know what she would find. Her fingers grazed the paper, and the numbers made her stomach joltingly specific. The year on the certificate placed him not in his 50s, not in his 40s, but in an age that, when she did the sum, meant he was 30 years older than she was. The paper was a little thing. It had the foil of legal ink and the dryness of a world that writes degrees into the skin. She felt the word shock as a physical thing, like a small animal. For a breath she could not make the shapes of her memory sit in their place. It was as if all the photographs that had once been layered were suddenly pulled away, and the portrait beneath, older and more complicated, revealed itself. She carried the sheet across the corridor until she found Gihan by the window, watching the street as if it were an ordinance of time. The light cut across him and made the silver at his temples flare. "You never told me," she said simply. He placed his hand over the paper as if to shield it from her. For a long moment, nothing was said. The house held its surface again, polite and expectant. "I did not think it would help," he said at last. "I thought the distance would help us all. I thought—" He stopped, because the reasoning of someone in a house that measures life in ledgers does not always translate to the small, burning currency of a person's heart. "I did not mean to mislead you. I thought by showing you kindness I might be able to protect you from the worst." She had signed with a pen when fear had been loudest. He had let kindness trick her into believing resemblance was history. Both of them had half-truths in their hands. "You're 30 years older,"
she said, tasting the literalness of it as if it might hold him as a fact and not as a story. Yes, he said, and still. He did not finish. What followed was not a confession of seduction, but of a more complicated devotion. The nights he had walked wards and made sure food was sent to her table, the times he had taken a phone call and answered it as if he were protecting her, the way he had been the family's instrument of both custody and kindness. He was older, but he had been keeping an eye on her without trying to make her his possession alone. The revelation reframed everything they had gone through. She had signed the contract with a man whose face recalled the young savior, merely because blood and time had made resemblances. The hair tie was not proof of a promise made by him when he was young. It was evidence of likeness and the house's strange talent for making things appear related when they were only neighbors of a memory. "You could have told me," she said. It was not an accusation she felt able to make much more of. "You could have said, 'I am older. I carry my choices like a ledger. You can leave.'" He looked at her the way someone looks at a ledger with pen in hand, knowing that some entries must be amended. "I did not want you to feel you were being bargained for," he said, "and perhaps because of that, I bargained without asking." Her laugh that came out had no mirth. It had the sound of someone emptying pockets and discovering how much they had lost. In the corridor, the world did not care whether her feelings were sewn into the margins of the estate's accounts. The nurses rolled by. Someone pushed a cart with linens. In the ward, the man who had saved her stared with uncertain focus at a hair tie on her wrist. At noon, they brought him into a sitting room that the family kept on reserve for reconciliations and interrogations. The man, Gilbert, sat upright for a moment, the world wobbling as he found the gravity of his own life again. Then, with the halting courage of someone piecing together their narrative, he said, "If I saved you, then I am glad. If I left because I had nowhere to belong yet." The sentence landed like a bell. It was not a plea. He did not point across the room to the man whose papers declared him a certain age. Instead, he put an index finger to the hair tie and smiled the way someone remembers the shape of a thing. That night, Ani had an odd thing happen. She felt less betrayed and more quietly untied. The world had changed. The facts had rearranged. The house had not changed. She had not undone the signature on the contract. But she had new knowledge. The man she had married was not the young savior she remembered. He was an elder, with his own reasons and his own debts. She could have left then. The law would have acknowledged her rights. She could have walked out carrying the diary, the hair tie, the ashes. The choice was there, like a door, and doors in the G estate were not always exits. Sometimes they were traps disguised as freedoms. She balanced the possibilities like weighing coins. Instead, she did something harder and smaller. She spoke frankly to the man who had been both protector and patron, to the one whose birth certificate had become an unexpected revelation. "You let yourself be both," she said. "You were the house's instrument, and sometimes you were my hand. Which one are you when neither is required?" Gianni put his hands together as if in prayer. "I am a man who has been taught to make choices for the family, and who is discovering that some of them are wrong," he said. "I do not want to be the house's instrument anymore. I do not know whether I can be more than what I have been capable of." "Then show me," Ani said, thinking of all the small cruelties that folded her like paper. "Do not tell me with a ledger. Show me in ways that cannot be undone by the house." He swallowed. The silence held a transaction like a jewel hidden in a cushion. In the days that followed, the family unraveled under its own designs. Madame G's careful theater of control began to crack in unexpected ways. Mr. Park confessed to having misfiled documents when he thought no one would notice. A servant testified that she had seen the wrong body moved because someone wanted to close a scandal. Social pressure, that delicate and insistent animal, moved in a way Madame G had misjudged. John, quiet and enigmatic, worked in the margins. He brought the bottle again to the recovery room, and this time he placed it in the hands of the man who had been called Gilbert. The medicine steadied him, then did more. It washed small patches of memory in and out until he could recall names and places he had left like threads. He sat with Ani in the bay window of the recovery room, while afternoon cut across the ward in pale knives. His speech was hesitant, the words of someone learning to recite their own life. "I saved you because it was the only thing I could do at the time," he said. "There were not many reasons to stay where I came from.
The world had been harder. I was younger then. I think, he touched the hair tie on her wrist with a rough thumb. I remember wanting to leave you something that would not belong to house or paper.
She understood the sentence as a translation of everything they had both been experiencing, the small things that do not fit in ledgers. "I thought he was you," she said suddenly, meaning Gianni. She did not mean to be cruel. She meant to be honest. "When I met him, I thought it was the same hand." Gilbert's eyebrows met in an expression that was more of wonder than confusion. "People look like other people," he said, "but we are not the same." The hours made small ripples. Madame G began to look smaller in the edges of rooms where so many small people refused to be pushed into subplots of dynasty. The revelations that had been arranged as weapons turned out to be brittle. The house could not manage every lie it had set in motion. Legal collateral shifted. With Gilbert awake and able to testify, the hospital issued a statement. The corpse had been misidentified, and an investigation would be made into who had falsified the identification. Documents surfaced that put parts of Madame G's influence into question. For all her power, she had never been all-powerful. The family's veneer peeled back in a way that was, for Ani, both vindication and strange small pity. The diary came back to her in pieces. Pages had been thumbed. Some lines had been smudged in the fold between discovery and claim. She held it like a map she had already walked. Each page reopened a childhood door. In the aftermath of all this, Gianni did something Ani had not expected. He asked her to sit with him in the library and offered a single, uncluttered truth. "You signed the contract in tears," he said. It was the simple acknowledgement of what had launched them into this mess, as if by saying it aloud they could unclench it of its violence. It was a thing of shame and survival. I cannot take back the way it started, but I can choose how it continues. She listened. He spoke of his mother, Madame G's iron hold, of the ways duty had been a language taught like a prayer, of the time he had been both cruel and kind because he could not see how to flee from the scripts he had been assigned. He told her small truths about how he had taken steps very quietly to keep certain things from his mother simply because he thought they were wrong. He did not claim heroism. He claimed the small things he had done that in the calculus of the house had been inconvenient to him. In the telling, he seemed to abrade the armor that kept him functioning as an instrument. When he finished, he reached out and took her hand with a gentleness that had not been a public performance. "I am 30 years your senior," he said. "I am not asking you to forget how the contract began. I am asking you to consider the possibility that we can define what comes next. I will not demand it be easy. I will not demand the house have the last word. But if you will let me, I will stand with your choices rather than against them." The words were small, and they were dangerous. He was asking the very person he had bound by a contract to give him something she had not yet had, freedom from being owned. Ani thought of the hair tie, a diary, the ashes in a lacquer box, and the weight of signatures and choices she had already made. She thought of the man who had, years before, given her a token in the snow, and then left like a figure from a story. She thought of the man who sat before her now, older than the photograph, whose life had been recorded in legal ink, and whose hands had steadied storms in small ways. "I will not be a consolation prize," she said. There was no softness in her voice. "I will not be something to be bartered with. If this continues, it will be because I choose to remain." He looked at her with a complex of relief and pain. "I would not have you otherwise," he said. They spoke terms, practical things that made the future less about vows and more about agency. Ani would have custody of her mother's diary and ashes. She would be allowed to continue her work outside the estate whenever she wished, with the G family providing none of the usual pretexts for blocking her engagements. She would be free to leave, and no legal measure would be placed on her that would force her to remain beyond her will. He would challenge the family's old edicts and not side reflexively with the household ledger when her rights were concerned. He would not hide his age or pretend resemblance was history. It was a bargain of dignity rather than romance, a fragile covenant of respect. It was not mitigation of abuse, but a proposed repair by two people who had both been shaped by forces that hurt them. The house humbled a little. Madame G, deprived of the clean mend she intended to make by the staged corpse and falsified papers, retreated into a smaller strategy. She had lost the instant decisiveness she preferred. People began to see that the G name did not automatically sanction cruelty. There was one last reckoning. Mr. Park, who had helped engineer the small, dark rooms and the misfiled papers, was confronted with himself by those who had the appetite for truth. Under pressure, he revealed how the body had been substituted. A foreign man who had nothing to claim him had been presented. The scandal broke in a set of formal inquiries. It did not fix all the harms, but it made a neat public space for them to be spoken of. In the end, the man Ani had once believed was the young savior found steadiness again in the world outside the house's particular gravity. He recovered enough to find work at a clinic arranging programs for displaced laborers. His laugh returned in small fits when he spoke of the oddities of life that had once nearly broken him. He and Ani became, in the softest sense, witnesses to one another. She had signed to free him. He had survived enough to say his life had meaning beyond being a prop in a family drama. There was a final scene the house did not expect.
On a late afternoon, in a small, sunless studio she had been allowed to reclaim, Ani set the hair tie on the bench and opened the diary. She read, slowly, the lines her mother had once written and the foreign scrawl beneath them. Then she wrote, in the margin, with a pen that felt like an honest instrument, a note she intended for no one else. For now, she wrote, I am choosing to stay, not because I do not know how to leave, but because I will not be the kind of woman who lets fear decide the shape of her days. The note folded like a small flag. She left it tucked inside the diary, where no one but she would find it. That evening, Gianni came to the studio not as a man who controlled space, but as someone who had come to ask permission. He stood in the doorway like someone about to read a wrong line, and then bowed in a way that was neither servile nor entitled, simple respect. There is something else, he said. He had a small box in his hand that had nothing to do with ledgers. It was cedar, plain, like a thing you give to someone you hope will open it and not find economics inside, but a simple truth of presence. He opened it to reveal a small, unpretentious ring. It was nothing like the rings in the family portraits, no jewels and no announcements. It was a narrow band of hammered silver, something Ani might have made herself if she had had the time and the strength. It was not the sort of ring that could erase their differences or the pain of how things had begun. He did not speak with the theatricality of a proposal. He offered it like a question that had left all other choices intact. If you would accept this for what it is, he said, with the humility of someone who had once measured his life in other people's ledgers, I will wear the part of a companion who helps you live the life you want. No more contracts, no more signatures used as cages. Ani looked at him and saw an older man, yes, but one who had chosen in recent days, not to protect property, but to challenge the property lines that had defined him. She thought of how often the world expects a person to stay in the role they were given, and how radical it would be to refuse the script and instead write a small one together. She took the ring. Her fingers closed around it like a small agreement between two people who had been, until a few weeks prior, each other's instruments. If we do this, she said quietly, it must be honest. We will not offer each other what we cannot keep. We will not pretend the past is not the past. He nodded as if accepting terms he should have accepted all along. I will not pretend it was not my fault, he said. I will not hide the ledger. I will show you what I can make different. They put the ring on each other's hands in a private ceremony that had no fanfare, but an enormous consequence. They tried to redefine marriage as a mutual covenant rather than a contract of possession. It did not undo what she had signed in tears earlier.
It was not a balm for every harm, but it was a pledge to change the shape of the days to come. The house watched. It was an old habit. Its portraits leaned in and then out, as if disappointed, and then intrigued. Madame G remained in the drawing rooms, writing letters and conceding ground in the way powerful people do when power is made complicated. The man who had once been presented as dead found a life of contribution and small joys. Gong Ming, who had watched and intervened, returned to the city with an ambiguous smile and promises that implied he might turn up again when needed. In the quiet that followed, Ani took the diary and the hair tie, and the small lacquer box with her mother's ashes to a window that faced the gardens. She opened the sash and let the afternoon in. The trees there had been trimmed with the same precise cruelty the family kept as its rhythm, but wind loosened leaves enough to make a noise like forgiveness. She brought the small urn closer and spoke softly to the person she had been and to the woman who had taught her to keep small, unbreakable things. "I signed," she said into the sun, "because I was afraid, but I am here now because I choose to be." She tied the hair tie once again to her wrist, not because it bound her now, but because it reminded her what had brought her to this shape. It reminded her that the world gives you small things you can use to anchor yourself when ledgers and signatures try to take you apart. Gianni watched from the doorway. He did not touch the diary. He did not attempt to move the ashes. He had learned the weight of such things. Instead, he took the armchair and sat so that he could be near but not overwhelmingly present, a position of respect rather than possession. When Ani put the diary back in the box and closed it, the notebook's edges looked softer, the pages worn into a life. She had lost nights and found truth. She had been given back a man who had been presented as dead, and she had been given the knowledge of the man she had married's true age. None of these things simplified her world, but they made it possible for her to choose the way forward. Madame G never apologized in words anyone could use. Her apology arrived in the form of a retraction, a tiny, controlled loosening of the grip, an admission in a letter she submitted to the family council, acknowledging irregularities in the handling of the Gilbert matter. It was not magnanimity, it was the calculus of a woman who, having been found out, chose to preserve what she could. There were hearings, there were settlements, there were gossip columns that found the story to be a feast. Ani read nothing of it that her mother had taught her to trust. Newspapers were not friends.
She listened instead to the small sounds of her own days, the ring on her finger, the clink of metal in her workshop, the breath of a man who had been returned to life, and the quiet, sometimes awkward, companionship of the man who had insisted on being rewritten. Weeks later, in a small ceremony almost designed to be private, Gianni took her hand in front of a few friends, Gilbert among them, and spoke with a seriousness that had not been part of the bargain he had made earlier. "I am 30 years older than you," he said plainly to those gathered. "I have been both the author and the executor of certain harms. I am sorry for the ways I let myself be the house's instrument. I ask to be something else now." He did not ask for forgiveness as a thing to be given as tribute. He asked for the chance to be judged by future kindness, not past ledger entries. Ani looked at the man who had wavered so often between possession and protection and felt, finally, a trembling possibility. That age can be a fact without being a cage. That suffering began in many places, and healing might start with terms agreed freely. She answered in the only way she knew how, both with a vow to herself and with a vow that carried risk. "I will stay," she said, "not because I was forced, but because I choose to be here, with conditions." She listed the terms she had spoken earlier: freedom to work, the return of her mother's diary as a right, a promise that no paper would be used to confine her again without her consent, and, most of all, the agreement that the house would not be the measure of her life. When the room's small formalities ended, John came up to her and offered a small nod. He did not speak of the bottle or the bargain. He simply said, "You did not offer yourself without reason. The world will be cruel. This house will try to be clever. Now you know what to watch." Ani smiled then, not big and not false, the small, honest smile of one who has picked up tools and plans to use them. She had signed in tears once. She had said yes to a life she had not wanted. That signature could not be erased, but she had also learned how to read the margins and to write additions. As the months passed, her work found small recognition outside the estate. She taught a night class to young designers who could not afford formal schools, and started a small program to teach women in the city how to make modest pieces to sell. Gianni used his influence, carefully, to open doors rather than to close them. He argued in family councils for reforms that would make things smaller for those with less power. He availed himself of the awkwardness of being older, and used it to apologize by action rather than rhetoric. One winter,
much like the one that had taught her about the way memory could become a shelter. Ani walked to a small cafe with Gilbert on her arm and Gianni close beside her, and the hair tie on her wrist nodded like an old merit badge.
A child running in the street dropped a loose ribbon, and Ani bent to pick it up. The little girl's eyes followed them, and then rested on the scar near Johnny's ear. "He looks like my grandfather," she said, surprised. Ani thought of the nature of resemblance, a trait that could make one think they had found a map of the past when all it really offered was a contour. She thought of choices layered over choices. She thought of how she had been forced to sign a contract in tears, and how the world afterward had reshaped her out of its own machinations. If she had been asked to speak of her marriage then, she would have said this. Some unions begin in paper and coercion, and yet, seldom, two people find in the ruins of such a beginning the possibility of something that is theirs. It is not a fairy tale. It is a hard, small, ordinary work of choosing, day by day, whether to remain instruments or to become companions. The diary stayed on her bench. The ashes in the small lacquer box were placed on her mantel. She lit incense sometimes and said things into the air meant only for the woman who had taught her how to knot hair ties and hide diary pages. The man who had saved her, Gilbert, worked at the clinic and taught children to whistle again. The man she had married was 30 years older, and sometimes his hands trembled when he spoke of the past, and sometimes he was steady enough to hold her in new ways. They did not pretend the age gap was an irrelevant fact. They acknowledged it as a truth that came with its own considerations. But they decided, together, that truth did not have to be weaponized into a cage. She had signed a contract in tears at the start. By the end, she had signed again, and differently, with eyes open. The last image that lingered as she closed the diary one evening was not the mahogany table and the lawyer's polite nod. It was the hair tie, knotted and reknotted, a small thing that had survived being a token and a tether. It sat on her wrist as she looked at the man beside her, older, complicated, sincere sometimes, fallible always, and felt a sense of hard hope settle into the hollow of her ribs. If someone later told the story, they might say she married a man 30 years her senior, and that she had signed a contract as a terrified woman. Both would be true, but the whole truth was larger. She had kept her mother's diary. She had freed a man who had been said to be dead. She had exposed a family's stagecraft, and she had carved out a small space in which to be more than a signature. She had signed in tears. She had learned a truth that would alter the way she saw her life. And when she looked at her husband, older by 3 decades, carrying his papers and his regrets, she did not see a thief of her days, but a man who had been given a second instruction and chosen, imperfectly and bravely, to follow it. She tied the hair tie into a new knot that night, slow and deliberate, and the knot felt different.
It was not a symbol of belonging to someone else. It was a marker of the fragile, necessary fact that even the things that begin with coercion can, if handled with honesty and stubbornness, become the beginning of something chosen.